Everyone knows Pontius Pilate as the man who authorized Jesus' crucifixion, but almost no one talks about what happened to him afterward. Removed from power, disgraced before Rome, and surrounded by mystery, Pilate's final years read like the beginning of a curse. Did he live in regret, die in shame, or face a tragic end as judgment closed in on him? Stay with me because his downfall in 37 AD is darker than most people imagine. There is a question most people never stop to ask. What happens to a man after he looks truth in the face and chooses to walk away from it? Pilate stood before the most innocent man who ever lived, heard his own wife's warning, felt the weight of something he could not explain, and still handed him over. That moment did not end when the crowd dispersed. It followed him. It settled into his bones. Because when you reject the light and choose the crowd instead, something shifts inside you that no political title, no military escort, and no imperial favor can ever reverse. Pilate's story after the crucifixion is not just ancient history. It is a spiritual warning that echoes across every generation. Blood remained. You need to understand something about that moment when Pilate washed his hands before the crowd. He called for a basin. He poured water over his fingers in front of everyone. He declared publicly that he was innocent of the blood of that righteous man. And then he handed Jesus over to be crucified anyway. That gesture was not an act of innocence. It was the most damning confession a governor could make. Because Pilate knew. He said it himself. He called Jesus righteous. He found no fault in him. He tried to release him more than once. His own wife sent him a message during the trial, telling him she had suffered greatly in a dream because of that just man. Everything around Pilate screamed, "Do not do this." And he did it anyway. That is the moment the blood remained. Not on his hands in a literal sense, but on his conscience, on his authority, on the spiritual trajectory of his entire life from that point forward. You cannot preside over the sentencing of the Son of God. Know in your gut that you are making the wrong decision. Do it anyway to save your political standing, and then walk away untouched. That is not how the spiritual realm works. Every ancient tradition that speaks of Pilate after the crucifixion tells the same story in different ways. Something broke inside that man that day, and it never healed. Think about what Pilate was really trying to do with that basin. He was trying to separate himself from consequence without separating himself from the act. He wanted the benefit of compliance without the weight of guilt. He wanted the crowd to stop pressuring him, Rome to stay satisfied, and his own conscience to remain clean, all at the same time. But you cannot serve truth and betrayal in the same breath. You cannot wash your hands of something your hands just signed into motion. That water did not cleanse him. It marked him. It became the most famous failed attempt at moral escape in human history. And here is the deeper truth. Pilate's mistake was not just political cowardice. It was spiritual blindness. He had the truth standing right in front of him, literally in the flesh, and he asked, "What is truth?" as if it were a philosophical question. But truth was not a concept that day. Truth was a person. Truth had a name. Truth was looking him in the eyes. And Pilate turned away. That turning was not just a decision, it was a spiritual fracture. And everything that followed in his life flowed directly from that fracture. The blood he tried to wash off did not go anywhere. It remained. It clung. And it spoke. Strange signs. After the crucifixion, something shifted in the atmosphere around Pilate's life. Ancient writings and early Christian traditions describe unusual events surrounding the governor of Judea in the months and years that followed. Whether you read the letters attributed to him, the accounts preserved by early church historians, or the traditions passed down through centuries of Christian reflection, they all point in the same direction. Pilate's world began to unravel in ways that went beyond politics. There were disturbances he could not explain, an unease that would not lift. a weight that settled over his household and his authority like a fog that had no natural origin. You have to understand how the spiritual world responds to pivotal moments. When a man stands at the crossroads of eternal consequence and chooses darkness, the effects do not stay contained within that single decision. They ripple outward. They touch everything connected to that person, their family, their position, their peace of mind. Pilate may have returned to his routine after the crucifixion. He may have resumed his duties as governor, signed orders, held hearings, maintained appearances. But something behind the scenes had already changed. The ground beneath his authority had shifted, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks became visible to everyone. Early traditions speak of Pilate being unable to find rest, his sleep disturbed, his confidence shaken. The man who once sat on the judgment seat with the full weight of Rome behind him began to feel something he had never felt before: the sensation of being watched, measured, and found lacking by a power far greater than Caesar. This is what happens when you encounter the divine and reject it. The encounter does not simply end, it lingers. It follows you into every room, every decision, every quiet moment when the noise dies down and you are left alone with what you have done. Some traditions say that Pilate's wife never recovered from the spiritual impact of that day. Her dream was not just a warning, it was an encounter. She touched something in the spiritual realm that morning, and it marked her permanently. Whether she became a believer, as some ancient sources suggest, or whether she lived the rest of her life under the shadow of that vision, her experience tells you something important. The events surrounding the crucifixion did not stay within the walls of the Praetorium. They radiated outward. They affected everyone who was close to the decision. And if his own wife was shaken to her core by a dream, what do you think was happening inside the man who actually gave the order? The signs were not theatrical. They were not dramatic displays of fire and judgment falling from the sky. They were quieter than that and far more devastating. A slow erosion of peace. A growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. A spiritual pressure that no amount of Roman discipline, political maneuvering, or personal denial could relieve. Pilate was living in the aftermath of the most consequential rejection in human history, and the aftermath was not silent. Rome watched. Pilate made a critical miscalculation. He thought that by giving the crowd what they wanted, he was protecting his position. He thought Rome would be pleased with a governor who kept order, who prevented a potential uprising by sacrificing one man the Jews demanded be killed. But Rome did not operate on the currency of crowd approval. Rome watched everything. Rome measured competence by results, not by applause. And the results coming out of Judea under Pilate's leadership were beginning to tell a very different story from the one he wanted Rome to hear. You need to understand what kind of pressure a Roman governor operated under. Judea was not a prestigious assignment. It was a volatile, rebellious, religiously complicated province that most Roman officials wanted nothing to do with. The fact that Pilate held the position for roughly 10 years tells you he had some measure of political skill. But political skill and spiritual discernment are not the same thing. You can manage a province and still be blind to the forces that are quietly dismantling your authority from the inside out. Reports were reaching Rome, complaints from the Jewish leadership, from local populations, from anyone who had been wronged or provoked by Pilate's heavy-handed governance. There were incidents before the crucifixion that had already put him on thin ice. The episode with the Roman standards brought into Jerusalem, the use of temple funds to build an aqueduct, the violent suppression of protests. Each of these events chipped away at Rome's confidence in him. But after the crucifixion, the trajectory accelerated. It was as if the one decision he thought would buy him peace became the very thing that sealed his downfall. This is a spiritual principle you cannot afford to ignore. When you compromise the truth to preserve your position, you lose both. Pilate gave up his integrity to keep his seat, and what happened? He lost the seat anyway. The very thing he sacrificed Jesus to protect was taken from him. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic moment, but through a slow, relentless process of erosion that he could not stop. Every report that reached Rome, every complaint, every incident of mismanagement was another stone removed from the foundation he thought was solid. Rome was not just watching Pilate's political performance. Rome was unknowingly participating in a spiritual timeline. The same empire that authorized the crucifixion was now becoming the instrument through which Pilate would face consequence. Not because Rome understood what had really happened on that hill outside Jerusalem, but because God does not need human awareness to carry out divine justice. He uses the systems of this world, the very systems men trust more than they trust him, to accomplish what he has determined. Pilate trusted Rome. Rome became his undoing. And the irony is sharper than any sword the empire ever forged. Power crumbled. The incident that finally broke Pilate's hold on power came in Samaria. A self-proclaimed prophet gathered a large crowd on Mount Gerizim, promising to show them sacred vessels that he claimed Moses had buried there. The crowd was massive. It was armed. And whether or not there was a genuine insurrection in the making, Pilate responded the way he always responded, with overwhelming force. He sent soldiers to block the mountain. The confrontation turned violent. People were killed. Leaders of the movement were captured and executed. On the surface, this looked like standard Roman governance. Suppress the uprising, restore order, send a message. But Pilate had miscalculated the political moment. The Samaritans were not a hostile foreign population. They were subjects of Rome, and they had the right to petition. And petition they did. They sent a formal complaint to Vitellius, the governor of Syria, who held authority over Pilate. They accused him of murder, not of restoring order. They said the people gathered on that mountain were not rebels, they were pilgrims. And the massacre was not a military operation. It was a slaughter of unarmed civilians. This complaint reached Vitellius at exactly the wrong time for Pilate. Vitellius was politically ambitious, well-connected, and had no interest in defending a subordinate governor who was generating this kind of controversy. He saw an opportunity, and he took it. Vitellius ordered Pilate to return to Rome to answer for his actions before the Emperor Tiberius himself. Just like that, the man who had judged Jesus was now being judged. The man who had sent an innocent man to death was now being summoned to defend his own life. Do not miss the spiritual precision of this. Pilate's downfall did not come from an unrelated event. It came from the exact same pattern that defined his handling of Jesus. A refusal to discern the truth about the people standing before him, a willingness to use violence instead of justice, and a reliance on political power instead of moral clarity. The Samaritan massacre was not random. It was the culmination of a life lived in reaction rather than righteousness. Pilate kept making the same mistake in different forms, and eventually the mistake caught up with him in a form he could not wash away. When power crumbles, it does not announce itself. It does not send a warning letter. It simply stops holding. One day you are giving orders, the next day you are receiving them. One day you sit on the judgment seat, the next day you stand before it. Pilate experienced this reversal not because of bad luck, but because the very thing he valued most, his authority, had been built on a foundation of compromise, violence, and moral cowardice. And foundations like that always crack. It is only a matter of time. Throne taken. When Vitellius gave the order for Pilate to return to Rome, something happened that no amount of political experience could have prepared him for. He was stripped of his office. The title of prefect, the military escort, the authority to command, the right to judge, all of it was removed. Pilate, the man who had looked the Son of God in the face and decided his fate, was now just a man. No title, no power, no protection. Just a long journey to Rome with the full knowledge that he might not survive what waited for him there. Think about what that journey must have been like. Weeks on the road, possibly by sea, moving toward a city where he would have to stand before the most powerful man in the world and explain why Samaritans were slaughtered under his command. But the real weight was not the political accusation. The real weight was everything he carried beneath it. The memory of a trial he should have stopped. The face of a man he knew was innocent. The words his wife whispered to him that morning. The water that could not wash what needed to be washed. All of it traveled with him. All of it sat in the silence between the waves, in the wind, in the sleepless nights. There is a principle in Scripture that you cannot ignore. God removes those who misuse the authority he allowed them to hold. Every position of power in this world exists under divine permission. Pilate did not become governor of Judea by accident. He was placed there, in that exact moment in history, for a reason. And when the moment came to do what was right, he failed. Not because he lacked information, not because he was deceived, but because he loved his position more than he loved the truth. And when that is your priority, the position itself becomes the instrument of your downfall. Pilate arrived in Rome, but by the time he got there, Tiberius was dead. The emperor who might have judged him was gone. Caligula had taken the throne, and with that shift, Pilate entered a new uncertainty. Would Caligula hear his case? Would he be pardoned, punished, exiled, or forgotten? The historical record becomes murky at this point, and that murkiness is itself a kind of judgment. A man who once commanded legions, who held the power of life and death, was now lost in the margins of imperial politics, waiting for a verdict that may have never come in any satisfying form. The throne was taken, not by a rival, not by a rebellion, not by a military coup. It was taken by the quiet, relentless movement of divine consequence. Pilate did not lose his position because he was incompetent. He lost it because he was positioned at the most important moment in human history and chose wrong. And when you choose wrong at that level, the consequences do not come in human proportions. They come in eternal ones. Exiles wait. What happened to Pilate after he arrived in Rome is wrapped in layers of tradition, speculation, and silence. Some ancient sources say he was exiled to Gaul, to a city called Vienne. Others place him in different locations. What nearly all the traditions agree on is this: Pilate did not return to power. He did not regain his title. He did not resume any meaningful public role. Whatever happened to him after his removal from Judea, it was not a restoration. It was a descent. Exile is not just a change of location. It is a stripping of identity. For a man like Pilate, whose entire sense of self was built on Roman authority, political rank, and the ability to command, exile meant the complete dismantling of everything he thought he was. He was no longer the prefect. He was no longer the judge. He was no longer the man who sat above others and determined their fate. He was now the man others had determined the fate of. And that reversal carries a weight that no physical journey can describe. Think about what exile does to the mind. You wake up in a place that is not yours. You are surrounded by people who do not know your history or do not care. The language of power you once spoke fluently now has no audience. The connections you relied on are gone. The systems that once protected you now ignore you. You are alone with your thoughts, your memories, and the full, unfiltered weight of everything you have done. For most people, exile is a punishment of distance. For Pilate, it was a punishment of proximity. Proximity to himself, to his decisions, to the one decision that defined the rest of his existence. There is a spiritual reality here that most people miss. God does not always punish through dramatic events. Sometimes the heaviest judgment is simply removing the noise, taking away the distractions, stripping away the titles, the crowds, the responsibilities, the busyness, until all that is left is you and the truth you have been avoiding. That is what exile did to Pilate. It removed every buffer between him and the memory of what he had done. No more crowds to manage, No more cases to hear. No more imperial duties to hide behind. Just silence. And in that silence, the face of the man he condemned would not have faded. It would have grown clearer. Some early Christian writers suggest that Pilate, in his exile, was tormented by his conscience to the point of despair. Whether or not that is historically provable, it is spiritually consistent. A man who encounters Christ, recognizes his innocence, and still hands him over to death does not walk away from that encounter unchanged. The encounter stays. It embeds itself in the deepest part of the soul. And when the world finally goes quiet around you, that encounter becomes the loudest voice in the room. Truth ignored. There is a moment in the trial of Jesus that reveals more about Pilate's soul than any political record ever could. Jesus stood before him and said, "Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate responded with 3 words that have echoed through the centuries. What is truth? He did not ask it as a seeker. He asked it as a man who had already decided that truth was irrelevant. That question was not a search, it was a dismissal. And that dismissal became the hinge on which his entire life turned. You need to understand what was happening in that moment. Truth was not a concept floating in the air between them. Truth was standing there, in human flesh, looking directly at Pilate with eyes that saw everything: his fear, his ambition, his weakness, his potential, his cowardice. Jesus did not argue with Pilate. He did not try to convince him. He simply presented himself. And that is exactly how truth operates. It does not force itself on you. It does not beg for your attention. It stands before you, reveals itself, and waits for your response. What you do with it determines what it does with you. Pilate's tragedy is not that he did not have access to the truth. His tragedy is that truth was closer to him than it has been to almost any other human being in history, and he still turned away. He had a private conversation with the incarnate Word of God. He heard things that no Roman governor was supposed to hear. He was given an opportunity that kings and prophets longed for and never received. And he treated it as an inconvenience, a distraction from the political problem he was trying to solve. This is the pattern that leads to ruin, not ignorance, but the deliberate dismissal of what you already know to be true. Pilate was not deceived by false prophets. He was not led astray by bad theology. He was not confused by competing claims. He knew. He admitted it publicly. He said, "I find no fault in him." And then he acted against his own declaration. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. And choices like that do not float away into history without consequence. They anchor themselves to your soul and pull you downward. Every step of Pilate's decline after the crucifixion traces back to this single moment. The political disasters, the loss of authority, the exile, the despair, all of it flows from this one act of ignoring what he knew to be true. And the spiritual lesson is devastating in its simplicity. You do not have to commit great evil to be destroyed. You only have to ignore the truth when it stands right in front of you. That is enough. That is more than enough, because truth ignored does not disappear. It waits. And when it returns, it does not come as an invitation. It comes as a verdict. Broken crown. Pilate wore the crown of Roman authority. He carried the title, the seal, the military power, and the political weight of an empire that ruled the known world. But none of it protected him. None of it shielded him from what was coming. Because the crown he wore was not rooted in truth. It was rooted in compromise, in pragmatism, in the willingness to sacrifice what was right for what was convenient. And a crown built on that kind of foundation does not hold. It cracks, it splinters, and eventually it breaks. There is a difference between authority that comes from position and authority that comes from alignment with truth. Pilate had the first. He never had the second. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. You can sit on the highest seat in the land, command armies, issue decrees, and still be spiritually powerless if your authority is disconnected from the source of all authority. Pilate ruled over Judea, but he could not rule over his own conscience. He governed a province, but he could not govern his own fear. He held the power of life and death, but when the moment came to use that power justly, he handed it to the crowd. This is what a broken crown looks like. It is not a physical shattering, it is an internal collapse. The man still stands, the title still exists, the uniform still fits, but the substance behind it is gone. Pilate was hollowed out by his own decision. He became a title without truth, a judge without justice, a governor without moral ground to stand on. And the world eventually catches up to that kind of emptiness. It always does. Think about the contrast. Jesus stood before Pilate with no title, no army, no political backing, no earthly power of any kind. And yet he was the one who held authority. He told Pilate directly, "You would have no power over me at all unless it had been given to you from above." That statement reframed the entire scene. The man in chains was not the prisoner. The man on the throne was. Jesus was free in a way Pilate could never be, because Jesus was aligned with truth, with the Father, with the purpose for which he came. Pilate was bound by fear, by ambition, by the opinions of others, and by the crushing weight of a decision he knew was wrong. When your crown is broken, you feel it even before others see it. You still go through the motions. You still carry the responsibilities. You still sit in the seat. But something inside you knows that the authority is gone. The real authority. The kind that comes from standing on the right side of truth, no matter the cost. Pilate lost that the moment he handed Jesus over. And everything that followed, every political failure, every humiliation, every step into exile and obscurity, was simply the outward manifestation of a crown that had already broken on the inside. No way back. There comes a point in certain spiritual trajectories where the path behind you closes. Not because God stops offering grace, but because the person has walked so far in the wrong direction that they can no longer hear the voice calling them back. Pilate reached that point, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but step by step, decision by decision, silence by silence, until the distance between him and the truth he once stood face to face with became a gulf too wide to cross on his own. This is the most terrifying aspect of Pilate's story. He did not begin as a monster. He was not a man consumed by hatred or driven by bloodlust. He was an administrator, a politician, a man who wanted to keep his job, maintain order, and avoid unnecessary conflict. And that is precisely what makes his story so dangerous, because it shows you that you do not need to be overtly evil to be spiritually lost. You just need to be willing to compromise at the moment when compromise costs everything. After his removal from office, after his journey to Rome, after the death of Tiberius and the rise of Caligula, Pilate entered a period of historical silence. We do not have clear, detailed records of his daily life. What we have are fragments, traditions, and the echoes of a man who was slowly being erased from relevance. And that erasure is itself a kind of judgment. To go from the man who judged Jesus Christ to a man no one remembers clearly, that is not random. That is the spiritual consequence of choosing the wrong side of eternity. Some traditions say Pilate tried to appeal to the new emperor. Some say he was ignored. Some say he wandered through exile with the growing awareness that his life had become a monument to the wrong decision. Whether any of these specific accounts are historically verified is less important than the spiritual pattern they reveal. A man who had every opportunity to choose rightly, who was given more light than almost anyone in history, who made his choice and then spent the rest of his days living in the shadow of that choice with no way to undo it. There is a warning here that you need to take seriously. The opportunity to respond to truth does not last forever. It is not a standing offer. It comes in moments, in encounters, in specific windows of time where God positions you face to face with something real and asks you to respond. If you delay, if you dismiss, if you wash your hands and hope the moment passes, it will pass. But it will not pass without consequence. Pilate discovered this, and by the time he understood what he had lost, the door was no longer open. The path behind him had closed, and there was no way back. Final judgment. The exact manner of Pilate's death remains one of the most debated mysteries in early Christian and Roman history. Some ancient sources claim he took his own life. Eusebius, the early church historian, records that Pilate fell into such misfortune that he was compelled to become his own executioner. Other traditions say he was executed by the emperor. Some say he died in exile, broken and forgotten. A few traditions, particularly in the Ethiopian and Coptic churches, take a remarkably different view and suggest that Pilate eventually repented and even became a saint. But whatever the specific details, the arc of his story carries one unmistakable message. The man who judged Jesus was himself judged, and the verdict was devastating. Let that sink in. The man who sat on the judgment seat and asked, "What shall I do with Jesus?" spent the rest of his life being answered, not with words, but with events. Not with arguments, but with consequences. Every loss, every humiliation, every step downward was the universe responding to his question. What shall you do with Jesus? You will either receive him or you will be broken by the weight of having rejected him. There is no third option. There is no neutral ground. Pilate tried to find neutral ground. He tried to wash his hands. He tried to release Jesus through a custom. He tried to pass the decision to the crowd. And every attempt at neutrality only deepened his complicity. This is the final lesson of Pilate's life, and it speaks directly to every person watching this. You will stand before the same question Pilate stood before. Not in a Roman courtyard, not with soldiers behind you and a crowd before you, but in the quiet of your own heart, in the moments when truth confronts you and asks you to choose. And you will either receive it or reject it. You will either stand with what you know is right or hand it over to the crowd and pretend your hands are clean. Pilate's story is not ancient history. It is a mirror. It reflects every time you knew the truth and chose convenience. Every time you felt the pull of the Spirit and silenced it with logic, fear, or the opinions of others. Every time you asked, "What is truth?" not because you wanted to find it, but because you wanted permission to ignore it. Pilate is not just a figure from the past. He is a warning for the present. And his tragic end in 37 AD is not just the conclusion of one man's story. It is the beginning of a question that every soul must answer. What will you do with Jesus? Because that question does not expire. It does not lose relevance with time. It follows you the way it followed Pilate, through every season, every silence, every moment of reckoning. And unlike Pilate, you still have time to answer it differently. You still have the chance he lost. Do not waste it. Do not wash your hands. Do not turn away from what stands right in front of you, because the truth you reject today will become the judgment you face tomorrow. And by then, it may be too late to choose again.